Good morning. This is Tracy Hales Vass, right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM, Farmington, New Mexico. Today, I'm talking to Monika Ghattas about her book, Los Arabes of New Mexico, Compadres from a Distant Land. Good morning, Dr. Ghattas.
Good morning to you, and please call me Monika.
Monika, I certainly will. And I learned so much from your book, Los Arabes of New Mexico. I was fascinated to find the history of the Syrian immigrants. Now, I was really impressed that you did such a detailed study on this topic. What gave you the idea to write this or to study this?
Probably several things came together. First of all, I'm a historian. I'm interested in historical topics. Another reason was that my husband is Lebanese. I met him at the University of New Mexico. He came here. He's not part of this group I'm discussing here, but he came here to go to the university. And after we were married, just traveling around in close by, for example, going from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, there is a sign, Buttigers. It's an exit on the highway. There used to be years ago when we first talked about it, there was a curio shop and there was a filling station there and a bar or restaurant or something like that. Today it's just an exit. But he said, these people are Lebanese. And I said, oh, no, Buttiger is almost sort of Irish sounding to me. And he said, no, these are Lebanese. And slowly over time, I realized there were a lot of Lebanese around who had altered their names or completely changed their names.
Oh.
And most people wouldn't have recognized that.
Right.
And then I thought this is such an interesting topic, and I started reading and looking at it more closely, and I thought this is really worth a book. So over quite a few years, I worked on it and did interviews and things like that. I was teaching at the time, so I didn't have that much time, but eventually it all came together.
It certainly is rich in not only facts, but also photographs.
Yes, I was fortunate to get some photographs. There's probably a lot more around, but in most cases they're probably somewhere in a garage, as
Right.
people told me.
Yes.
They don't know exactly where anymore, so I made do with what we found.
And you took some of your own, so you traveled around the state finding some of these locations.
Yes, and Tracy, in some instances, in fact, in quite a few, these things have disappeared. Like in Mora, the Hanish House or the Hanish Store, down in Magdalena, in the interval, this has disappeared. They've either been repainted or reused for another purpose, or they just disappeared.
Wow.
I was glad that I took the photos when I did.
Right. And it was really impressive, though, that there is such a history in our state itself of the immigrants from Lebanon.
Oh, yeah. They all did quite well. And quite a few of them became prominent citizens. They were hard-working, they were frugal, they moved ahead, and they used every opportunity that came their way. It's really a very positive story.
It is a very positive story.
Yeah.
Another thing I found interesting was how they so easily assimilated with the Hispanic culture especially.
A lot of similarities there. They came from a village. They moved here to a village here. The social structures of the villages were very similar, many of the customs, the religion. So it was a very easy and quick assimilation. They did not live in special neighborhoods or anything like that. So
right.
It kind of almost disappeared within a generation. And then they also intermarried often with the Hispanics.
I saw that. I found that very interesting. And it made for a very peaceful community.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So you started this book in the 1800s. Is that when you traced back to the first immigrants?
Yes, the first immigrants came in the 1880s. You know, in 1880, the train came to Albuquerque and Santa Fe, or close to Santa Fe. That was important, a way to come this way. And then, of course, some of them came from Mexico. But again, they came via trains. So the train was important in their arrival, and I think that was true probably with the Italians and the Greeks, too. These immigrant groups came mainly from the East Coast, and they came via the train.
One thing that I was intrigued with was how they became, so many of them started off becoming peddlers when they really hadn't done that back home.
Yeah, this was sort of the entry-level job for the Lebanese and Syrians. I don't know when that happened, but, you know, like the Chinese all went into laundries, and I'm sure they weren't doing laundries in China. You know, somehow, once a few start on that, then the others all follow suit. And I think this was the case here.
Yeah, that was very interesting. And they did really well with that. And then many of them, like you said, went on to build their own stores.
Yeah. I think while they traveled around as peddlers and saved their money, they kind of identified a village, you know, that needed a general store. And that's where they went. And from what I understand, in northern New Mexico, and this was a time when there were still a lot of villages. You know, we don't have that many villages anymore. Now everybody is concentrated in towns. But around the turn of the century, even in the 1920s and 30s, there were still a lot of villages, and in many of these villages, it was a Lebanese family that had the general store in town, groceries and other things. I remember going down in Magdalena when that store was still operating, and they had wedding gowns, they had Western boots, they had some groceries. You know, it was sort of anything you would want.
A little bit of everything.
Yeah.
And one of these business people became quite affluent in Santa Fe, setting up a few of the famous landmarks there.
Well, almost all of them started as peddlers, especially the ones who came early, and they were savvy businessmen. You know, they saved their money, and then they invested in real estate. They set up their stores, became quite prominent in the community. And of course, the most famous in Santa Fe was Nathan Salmon, who he and his son-in-law built the Lensic Theater. But there were also the Fidel brothers, who had a number of businesses, including the Fidel Hotel. And there was a Khoury family that was also involved in retail. They built the theaters. They had almost all the theaters in Santa Fe. In fact, that was true for many of them in Española, in Bernalillo. They all loved the movies, and they bought or built movie theaters, and that was, of course, the upcoming business in the 1920s and 1930s.
Right.
That family in the Abuzalmans who lived in Bernalillo, they told me how on the weekends they had like a mobile movie projector, etc., and they would go up to Cuba and all those other villages, and they'd show movies there in some sort of a public building or whatever they had, and it was very successful.
Oh, that's great. Yes, they really had an eye for the business. That's great.
Yeah.
So you interviewed a lot of people. How did you track these people down to interview that had these stories?
You know, one led to the other, and of course, many of them are related. The early group of peddlers who came here were almost all related and came from the same village.
Right.
You know, one family would come, they were young men primarily, and they would bring then their cousin or their neighbor or their brother, and then that person would bring more. So they were related, and that was easy to interview them because, you know, I would go from one family to the next. And then I knew some families. It wasn't that difficult, although some of them were very suspicious about my intentions.
Sure.
It wasn't always, you know, easy to for them to open up, but that was a minority.
Well, that's fascinating. How long did it take you to compile all this information?
As I said, I, you know, did not do this all the time or full time, so it was several years. You know, I'd work on it for a few months, and then something else came up, or I was busy with a new class or with the family. So, but I probably spent a good 10 years and getting it together, and then finally sitting down and writing it all into a book form.
Very well researched and documented. And what else do you study historically as a history professor?
I am a European historian.
That makes sense.
I've done a lot of work with that. I'm also have a minor in Far East history, so I have taught courses in Japanese and Chinese history.
Oh, how exciting.
Of course, I'm retired now.
Right. And are you planning to write something else now?
Yeah, I'm kind of working on a memoir, and I here and there write more essays or short stories. I just had one published on an experience I had in the Czech Republic on a hiking trip, and I think I'd like to write more extensively about traveling and certain events or impressions.
Great.
That I encountered.
Right. Is there something you can read for us from your book?
Of course. Unfortunately, most of the peddling stories of the first-generation immigrants in New Mexico have been lost. There are, however, a couple of accounts that have survived and illustrate the plethora of experiences these people encountered. One of these tales comes from the Saad family. Abdu Yusuf Saad, that's the original family name, arrived here in the late 1880s, the first member of a large family that settled in New Mexico. Together with a few relatives, he pedaled with horse and wagon through much of northern and central New Mexico. But he missed his wife and two small sons, whom he had left behind in Mount Lebanon. So he sent a letter to his wife with one of his returning countrymen, asking her to send him a family photo that had been taken just before Saad's departure. But he returned home in 1898 before the photo arrived. Like so many others, he made a second trip to the New World and to New Mexico a few years later. This time, he brought his older son, Boutros Abdu, who would later be known as Peter A. or Dom Pedro, with him. They first sailed to Colombia to stay with relatives, then left for Mexico because of a looming political crisis. Similar problems in New Mexico convinced Saad to return to New Mexico, where he worked in Albuquerque and in Cerrillos. In 1908, father and son returned to Mount Lebanon so that Peter could get married. After World War I, the younger Saad, now married, and with a couple of children, immigrated to New Mexico, where he had been as a young boy with his father. Eventually, he established a mercantile business in Taos and also in Peñasco, but he also continued to peddle in the Hispanic villages of northern New Mexico. One evening, he was invited to stay overnight with a family in Rociada, a customary gesture in rural New Mexico. While the lady of the house went into the kitchen to get him something to eat, Saad looked around the room and was intrigued by a picture in a bronze-colored frame, prominently displayed with other religious items in the family's nicho. He went over to look at it more carefully. When the woman returned from the kitchen, she proudly explained that she had acquired this portrait of the Holy Family from an Arab peddler years ago. She went on to tell her astonished guest that this family treasure depicted Mary and Joseph with the baby Jesus and St. John. Saad, who had immediately recognized the lost family portraits, decided to leave things as they were and not destroy the symbolic value of the photo. Elias Francis, another early peddler, was one of the earliest ones in New Mexico. He traveled westward on the train, and a couple of his peddling experiences are part of the family history. To save money, he customarily spent the night in the train depot, but in Topeka, Kansas, the station master refused to let him do so and directed him to a nearby hotel instead. Francis realized he didn't have enough money to pay for his room and would have to sell some merchandise quickly. So he pulled out some of his traditional Arabic clothes that he had kept at the bottom of his pack. These included a tarbouche, which is a kind of a hat, the typical baggy Sharwal-style pants worn in Mount Lebanon, and an embroidered vest, to which he added several strings of beads and medallions. Playing the role of a holy man, he went downstairs and entered the hotel dining room, where he offered the astonished patrons a wide array of blessed relics from the Holy Land. He sold everything in no time at all, and the hotel manager, grateful for the free publicity, did not charge him for the room. In later years, he told his family that he made a vow that henceforth he would only stay in first-class hotels. His grandson, E. Lee Francis II, recounted another incident when his peddling grandfather fled Tierra Amarilla during the middle of the night because he heard a rumor that some people were going to rob him. Clearly amused, the former lieutenant governor under the Cargood administration in the 1970s added that he remembered that incident when he called up the New Mexico National Guard to put down the Reyes Lopez Tiarino courthouse raid in 1967.
Great stories. I was really impressed with the people that you wrote of, and I think this is a really good time in our society, in our history, to know about these people and their wonderful contributions to our society.
Oh, yes. Yes. They contributed, and many other immigrants contributed to enrich this country, and they enriched the state, and they didn't complain, and they made do, and they thrived, and it's very encouraging to read their stories.
Yes.
Hear about their and of course the peddlers were very colorful, and they in some ways took advantage of the situation, but
that's okay.
It was good. People welcomed them. They came from a place so far away. It opened up their point of view and their experiences, and they were all great storytellers. And the Hispanic community, they also have wonderful storytellers. So the cultures kind of supported each other.
Right. I was impressed. I'm not a native of New Mexico, but I have come to love it. And all the time I learn it's so rich in so many different cultures. It truly is a melting pot here. Yeah.
The state has been very blessed with many different people. And
yes.
Sometimes when you hear tri-cultures, and so it's much, much more complex than that. And,
absolutely.
These many different groups that came here, whether we're talking about the Jews or the Greeks or the Italians or the Arabs and Germans, I mean, they all, became a part of the state and contributed and are part of the tapestry here of when we talk about New Mexico.
Yes. So where can people find this book?
Where can they find it? Well, they can contact me, and the Albuquerque Museum has copies.
Okay.
And Duran Central Pharmacy in Albuquerque here always carries copies of the book.
Okay.
It used to be in quite a few bookstores, but I don't know how available it is anymore. Of course, they probably would be happy to procure a copy if somebody asked.
Yes. And what contact information should people use to contact you?
To me, they can send me an email.
Okay.
Ghattas
Okay.
at gmail.com.
That's MONGHATTAS.
Exactly.
Great. And so people can contact you to get a copy of that book, which is so well done. Now, did you collect?
Thank you.
Did you write it as you go, or did you collect all the information and then sit down and write?
I pretty much had the information together. Of course, as you start writing, you realize that there is something missing here, or
Right.
in the meantime, you've heard about this or that. You know, there are times when you stop and pursue something, you know, but most of the interviews and so I had put together and had already, ready to go. And I just had to kind of find some sort of an organizational structure for it. So
I like the way you organized it. In particular, the last chapter gives credit to the women, which I really appreciate.
Yes, when I give talks about this, and I often do give talks,
Mm-hmm.
I always mention that immigration history in this country has undergone some major changes in the last 30 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is apparent in this study because it used to be that only the poorest people came to this country, you know, and that really isn't so. In the case here, for example, it was often a whole family that financed a young person to come out and come to America.
Mm-hmm.
And also, what you just pointed out, in recent immigration studies, the role of women has become much more prominent.
Mm-hmm.
And that used to be not addressed at all. It was assumed that the women came here and they did the same thing they did in the old country. You know, they cooked, they cleaned, and they raised the children. But the women were really agents of change, too.
Right.
They had a new role in the case of the Arab peddlers. Many of the women were the ones who ran the store.
Mm-hmm.
And they learned English along with their children, if they had children, or brought children with them as the children entered school. You know, they kind of studied the same material, and they interacted with their neighbors. They became godmothers, and they taught cooking and things like that. So they integrated very well into the community, and I think they should be given some credit for that.
I do too. And I found it interesting, you mentioned cooking and how they would combine the Hispanic cooking with the Arab cooking.
Yes.
I thought that was great. What feasts there were.
Yeah, I mean, they're you know, once you're addicted to green chili,
it's true.
It goes with almost everything, and
That's
that's
right.
what they did. They added a lot of green chili, and also they came with considerable, how should I say, knowledge about herbs and things like that. And again, that complemented the same kind of expertise that was in the Hispanic villages. You know, so they kind of exchanged information and used the Hispanic, and the Hispanic community, you know, relied on the Los Árabes to help them with certain medical problems or
Right.
whatever was there. So that was also kind of interesting.
That was interesting. Yeah, I was surprised at the arena of talents and things that they were able to offer. It was great.
Exactly.
So,
and of course, they had a lot
yes.
of children. So
there you
something
go.
to. I mean, many of them had 8, 10, 12 children, and so there are so many in New Mexico, but who have totally merged into either the Hispanic or the Anglo communities, and they themselves, this is now the third, and in some cases the fourth generation, they only have a vague understanding of what their background is. They know there's something strange there, but they're not always sure.
Right.
Where great-grandfather actually came from. And, of course, they never had their, as they would have in the East, ethnic schools or their own churches. So they blended in so quickly.
Right.
And that was good in many ways. But on the other hand, it also meant that they kind of lost some of their identity.
That's
but
the
of course,
other
they can
side.
always look for it.
Yes, that's the other side of assimilation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good point. But these guys, you talked to some people in person that did remember quite a bit, so you were able to capture a lot of that.
And quite a few Adelos and Francis and Budigers, they made trips back home early on, but then also when they were of retirement age. And they went back and revisited with siblings and, former friends, and often stayed for months over there and then came back here. But so they kept up ties in many instances.
I was impressed with that they did go back and then come back again, because that had to have been quite the trip.
This is, we complain about trips today, but in those days, being steerage in the bottom of a boat.
Right.
I don't know how they did it, but they traveled.
Yes.
Thank you for coming and speaking, asking me questions. I enjoy talking about the book. I still give talks here and there about it. People seem to be always interested.
Yes.
It's certainly a part of New Mexico history,
and if somebody was interested in you talking, they can reach you at your email or your address.
Of course.
Oh, great.
Of course.
Yeah.
Very good.
Well, I appreciate reading the book. I learned, like I said, so much, and I appreciate the effort you put into this study. So, thank you again.
Well, thank you, and nice talking to you, Tracy.
It's been nice talking to you. And that was Monika Ghattas talking about her in-depth study, Los Arabes of New Mexico. This is Tracy Hales Vass, right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico.